So the war has ended. The 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice is signed, and it's time to move on to a post World War world. Um, and it's going to be peace, but it's not going to be a good peace. It's going to be a flawed peace. It's going to be a bitter peace for some of these countries afterwards. There were lots of loss, and there's going to be lots of anger left over. So, picking up the pieces after the war is over, there's a saying in history that the winners write the history, and the winners wrote the history here. Now, these four gentlemen that you see, this is Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States of America, Georges Clemenceau, who is the President of France, David Lloyd George, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and then Vittorio Orlando is the Prime Minister of Italy. These are your victors, if you want to look at it like that, and then they are going to decide what happens basically, and they are going to write the plan for peace. Well, Wilson already has some ideas. Remember, he didn't want to get into the war, but he did get into the war. And Wilson realizes that the war, what the war exposed was some issues. Okay, it's pretty obvious they exposed some issues. So he's going to give some speeches to Congress about peace without victory and some other things like that. And he writes the most important doctrine of his career, basically, and it's called the 14 Points Plan. You'll see this in U.S. history, I promise you. So the 14-point plan had all sorts of things within it. It's a plan for a lasting peace. It had stuff about no secret treaties. It had talked about reductions in armies and navies, getting rid of colonial claims in some ways and stuff like that. But the very last point that it had was a thing called a General Association of Nations. Okay. So that's what they came up with. In this General Association of Nations is going to be a meeting of all of the quote unquote civilized nations. But this is how the Americans typically saw it. Wilson's bringing his 14-point plan to all of these folks, and he's supposed to be the adult in the room. And all he's hearing is, Russia claiming things. Poland wants to be its own country. Italy wants stuff. France, the English, the enemy, even Germany is going to want some stuff, and he's supposed to be dealing with this. Well, these claims that they're talking about. Listen, we didn't lose that many people to this war. France devastated. Germany, obviously is going to be devastated. But the thing was, before they got onto German territory, the war was over, so they didn't really suffer that much damage to the interior of the country. But Britain, you had a whole generation destroyed. And Britain and France don't like the 14 points. They're concerned about their security. They've dealt with Germany before on this kind of thing. They're neighbors with Germany, and they want to strip Germany of its war-making power. So what ends up getting signed is this thing called the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles does some of the things from the 14 points that Wilson wanted. One of it was this thing called the League of Nations. And the League of Nations was this organization that they were talking about of countries getting together so that they could talk about issues before they blew up into war. It's a peace organization. But then there's the bad part, and that's the war guilt clause and the compensation. Another word for this would be reparations. War guilt clause meant that Germany had to take responsibility for being solely responsible for starting World War I. All the loss of life, everything, all the destruction rest solely on Germany's shoulders. And the other thing was that they were forced, according to this treaty, that they were basically not allowed to have any say in. You didn't see any German dudes in that picture that we looked at the beginning. They didn't have any say in how this treaty worked out. So they had to pay reparations to the Allies for their suffering as well. And that's going to be a real serious issue. Well, guess what? The way that the United States Constitution writes it out is that the president can't sign peace treaties. The United States Senate is in charge of approving peace treaties, and they didn't. The United States Senate rejected the treaty because a lot of Americans thought that it would just involve us in more European issues. Um, and they just didn't want it to be, they called it like a peace built on quicksand. Well, the problem is this League of Nations, and this is the a cartoon as you see here. This is going to be a bridge. Well, this is the most important stone, and when this this piece comes out here, it's not going to stand up. And the problem is that Wilson here has created this idea for the League of Nations, but when the United States isn't part of it, it's not going to work. So there are some serious issues going on with it. And then there are going to be some serious issues left over from the treaty as well in Europe. Here's a quick look at the map to remind us of what it looked like in 1914. Okay, before the war started, Austria-Hungary. You remember you had Serbia and these crews down here where it kind of all kicked off. Pay attention to this little piece of Italy right here in Austria-Hungary. Remember, Italy jumped in on our side in the war. And that's going to be something that's going to be popping up a little bit later as well. So take a quick look now at afterwards, and this is from a foreign country, but it was a good enough map to show you that this country now is all combined together into what we called Yugoslavia. Austria is separated from Hungary. Hungary becomes its own country, which is mostly Slavs. Austria is much smaller, much less powerful. The new country of Czechoslovakia shows up. Some Slavs, some Czechs, which are two different people. That's eventually going to erupt into problems. Yugoslavia down here is multiple countries that wanted their own independence going to erupt into problems. Hey, here's Poland, did not exist before. The Polish people are an ethnic group that have been around for years and years and years, and they always suffer being between the Soviet Union and Germany, and they're going to suffer again in World War II. But remember, I told you to look for that little piece of Italy over here? Look how much territory the Italians got. Wow. That looks like about the size of, well, I don't know, like Harnett County. After all they'd gone through in the war, they expected to get a lot more territory, and they did not. Another area I want to draw your attention to is right here along the border between France and Germany. This is an area called the Alsace-Lorraine area. Huge coal fields and things like that, full of natural resources, and also the Ardennes forest is right here in between Germany and France. Well, France gets the control of all this area. So you're going to see some problems. The United States rejects the treaty because they don't want to be part of the League of Nations. They want to stay out of European affairs. The war guilt clause and the reparations basically destroy Germany. It leaves bitterness from the German people, but also it ruins their economy because they can't get ahead because they owe all these people money. By the way, the United States forgave the debt from the reparations that the Germans owed them. And then you've got Italy peeved because they didn't get what they expected. And what you don't see on this map is over here to the east, the Japanese felt the same way. They expected a bigger chunk of territory and didn't get it either. And so those are going to be some things that are going to be lingering, leftover sort of issues. And those issues are going to turn eventually into World War II.